What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. And today on the podcast, we're joined by Benjamin Chicka. We met in our PhD program and have spent a lot of time since then having friendly arguments. But today we're not spelling out the battle over our philosophical positions, our understandings of divine action. No, we're talking about video games, because he is the author of Playing as Others, Theology and Ethical Responsibility in Video Games, and that's the conversation we're going to. In it, he brings together Paul Tillich, one of the pioneers of a theology of culture, and Emmanuel Levinas, that continental philosopher, ethicist, and helps kind of frame what is going on in culture in these kind of participatory games. What are the ethical questions, frameworks, and contexts that are being explored? What's going on in indie video games? How is the culture responding to different critiques and challenges? What are things like pluralism and economic injustice? How are they get explored? Neurodivergency, how are they wrestled with in video games? It's a wonderful book. I think the conversation captures some of what's there, but I encourage you to check it out. He's also the current president of the Paul Tillich Society at the American Academy of Religion, and he's coming to Theology Beer Camp. That's right, this October 17th and 19th. He'll be joining a whole bunch of theology nerds. We got over 30 different podcasts about God. I know there's 25 plus scholars of religion, theology, philosophy, biblical studies going to be in the house. Benjamin Chicka is going to be there, going to drop a conversation on the Geek Stage about video games. So I'm just saying, if you dig this, come on out. And you also could hang out with Diana Butler-Bass and Brian McLaren and Ilya Dilio and Gary Dorian and Jorg Rieger and John Tatamanel and Adam Clark and Grace G. Sun Kim. You see, it's going to be a good old time. TheologyBeer.camp. Grab your ticket and get ready to hang out with hundreds of people that like nerding out, high-quality craft beverages, and some fun. Well, guess what? Our next class here at Homebrewed Christianity is called Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us. And I'm going to be joined by Diana Butler-Bass and Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals, along with 6 different scholars who are going to help us understand not just what's going on in the public square and going on in America as we go into a election season. Oh, Christian nationalism, that's gross, that's disgusting. But what's next? What's after? What else? That's what we're going to be talking about, exploring and such. And if you would like to join us, head faithandpolitics.net. Come hang out with us. It's donation-based, including zero. So there's no excuse. And if you want to bring your friends, use some of the videos for a group, then do it. It'll be great. All right? Anyway, here we go. Benjamin Chicka, longtime friend, and video games. Enjoy. Everyone, this is Tripp, and on the podcast for the first time, but someone I've probably talked to as much as most of the people have been on a bunch of times, is Benjamin Chicka. He's the author of Playing as Others. Quite a fun new book, not only because it gets to talk about Paul Tillich and Levinas, but also video games. I am anticipating this semester, when getting to read this book with students, that people might actually finish it. Because unlike citing just straight ontological analysis of culture, it's a little more up-to-date, culturally engaged, and raising something that increasing numbers of students spend quite a bit of time on. Now, people that haven't got to meet you before and didn't listen to us argue throughout our PhD program, they may not know that you've had this ongoing conversation with largely ground of being theology and Paul Tillich and such. And like most people in our generation, you grow up playing video games. When did the idea that you could write an entire book about video games come on your mind as a philosophical theologian?
Thank you for having me on, Tripp. I'm very excited to be here. And if I can actually start with a little anecdote, like you kind of said, for those who don't know, that we've been arguing back and forth for years. Tripp and I first met in 2008 when we were both doctoral students at Claremont Graduate University under Philip Clayton, who has been on here a number of times. And we bonded, despite the fact that I was more ground of being and Tripp was more process. We bonded over the fact that we were both realists who couldn't stand this Wittgensteinian trend in a segment of Claremont Graduate University where religious statements are just language games that aren't about anything. It's just the way your community talks to each other, but they mean nothing real. But you should take this as a badge of honor. And we bonded over being realists. So we go back that far, but we have been debating which side to weigh more, process or ground of being, since then as well.
Oh yeah, it is a fun conversation. Which next time you're on the podcast, we'll end up arguing, because I did not put as many exclamation points and "this is thrilling" comments in your other most recent book, but that's just tempting people. That's tempting people because one of my favorite things about Paul Tillich is the way he frames the kind of religious significance of what's happening in culture, and inviting theologians to take seriously what's getting itself done in culture, rather than kind of reifying Christendom as culture. It kind of invites a way to start to engage culture in a different way.
So,
could you say a bit about that, like where people that may not be familiar get that?
Yeah, so I got too into my anecdote and didn't answer your first question.
Well, that's half my podcast.
Good. So I grew up playing video games my whole life. I am the average age of a video game player in the United States right now. And sure, lots of young kids play video games too, but I grew up with the industry. Some of my earliest memories are playing the Atari 2600 with my dad on a huge, 200-pound RCA wooden console TV. So I grew up with it, and I was fortunate that the neighborhood I grew up in middle school had me and 4 other boys that between of us, I think we had every single console that was released. So we would just kind of bounce around each other's houses playing games. So I grew up with it. And I think there'll be more of this, just like it was taboo once to be a serious academic and say something about TV shows or movies. Now every college and university in the world has classes on faith and film, philosophy and pop culture. As more academics grow up with video games being natural, I think more of this will happen. But one of the aha moments for me was grad school, really in the PhD program, started to speak at a couple gaming events. I was dabbling with talking about Tillich's Theology of Culture and video games, but then the flashpoint was Gamergate, which, for those who don't know, it was a misogynistic, sexist, turned into being homophobic and against all sorts of minorities, black creators in this industry too. Basically, a couple women in Boston were creating very different sorts of video games, and they got harassed just for being different. Like a lot of hateful movements, there's no good reason for it other than the people who were different were harassed. So they got death threats. The FBI eventually had to get involved. One of them had their daily routine tracked by somebody, and they said, "I know where you are at this time of day. I'm going to find you with a knife and kill you." They didn't. Nobody was harmed, not physically, but emotionally, certainly. And I all of a sudden was really curious, because a lot of my interest theologically was already in all sorts of pluralism, religious pluralism, but also a religious embrace of human diversity and different sorts of people, like LGBTQ plus rights, etc. So I was really interested academically in how the video game industry would respond to Gamergate, and I ended up speaking at PAX East 2015, and PAX East is a really huge video game convention. PAX East takes place in Boston, and now over 100,000 people attend it over a 4-day weekend, so Friday to Monday. And I was scared to death because they put me in one of the big rooms that the entertaining video game people get to be in, and not one of the corner rooms that serious talks go in, because 5 people will attend it. And I'm like, there's going to be 20 people here if I'm lucky, and this room holds 650. But people showed up. So it was called The Science of Online Bullying, A Lesson in Diversity. I gave it with a friend who was also then a doctoral student, Andrew Tripp at Boston University. And the room was full. The people stayed afterwards to talk to us. And I kind of started to see, they don't know Tillich's terms. They don't know Levinas's terms. But when these two thinkers talk about culture transforming people's lives and the ability to like ethically transform our behavior, I saw it already happening in like a hunger for it, like a real like thirsting for it in the video game community immediately after Gamergate, because Gamergate took place in like mid to late 2014. So we're just not even a full year later, and the industry is trying to adapt to its own failures. And I was impressed with the speed when you think about the way harmful religious practices are debated for like years and years and years and years. I was really impressed with the speed with which the industry really wanted to try and do better.
I can imagine that being real energizing, having ended up like on a panel at Comic-Con or doing something at a Tolkien Lord of the Rings type event where, you're really into it and you're like, wow, the only thing I really have to contribute here is that I'm into it and no cool words dead Germans use when they're feeling really serious late at night. And then you could be surprised that people who are so engaged in this particular part of pop culture are thrilled that someone's taking what's happening there seriously, and that these are places we can ask really big questions, and that what you're creating, what you're contributing to, the way you engage the larger stories, be it the comic books and how it relates to the MCU, or those people that read the Silmarillion every year and not just Lord of the Rings, and things like that. That all of a sudden there is this community where like these stories that are happening in culture, a whole lot's getting itself done. And yet the places that scholars of religion and philosophers of religion have so often wrestled with stories and communities and rituals and things have been these historic religious traditions. And I think that attraction to Tillich in that space is interesting because he was one of those first people to take culture so seriously as it kind of parted ways with the culture dominance of the church and say, no, we don't just have this antagonistic relationship with culture. Just we're going to figure out like how to sneakily, find our atonement theory and the Matrix or whatever. Like when you think of like these kind of shallow and cheesy engagements with culture and such, and the invitation people like Tillich and Levinas give, how do you see, like, especially people with religious dispositions, how should they start to see culture? Like, what is culture if it's a place you take seriously, questions of ultimate significance and concern?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of there's a chasm that I think is closing a little bit right now, where like Tillich talked about culture, so he had his theology of culture, but then he actually lived it. So he spoke at openings of Met Galas in New York City. He was engaged with artists. He wasn't just talking about them. But there is a kind of tendency in liberal theology to talk about the importance of culture and stuff outside of the church, and like the progressive movements that we're talking about are happening outside of church walls, and like that should be important to us and we should approve of it. But then that conversation is just talking to each other within church walls and in the academy. I'm not exactly saying I'm Tillich for a different century, but I mean, I speak at lots of video game conventions. I speak as much to video game fans as I do to fellow academics. I think somebody else who was a classmate of ours, John Gill, does this with hip hop, and is not just talking about hip hop, but is there at events engaged in the culture and not just saying like hip hop is important. And the idea is to not restrict. I mean, this was one of Tillich's. He used all sorts of symbolic language when talking about God. He could throw it around interchangeably all the time. Ground of being, unconditioned being. He had all sorts of symbolic terms for it. But his point of not just saying God all the time, but referring to different language was this transformative reality can break through in anything, including culture, and it's not just in a refined realm. Often when I speak at these events and I'm talking to especially game players, sometimes I've spoken at professional developer events, and when it's smaller, I'll actually use some Tillich and Levinas terms because they can ask me more questions and have a bit of a dialogue. But I don't throw around their terminology when I'm talking to just gamers usually. what I do is I talk about the transformations that they talk about, like the courage to be that can break through anywhere for Paul Tillich, ethical transformations that can happen for Levinas. And I tell them how I see it happening in their lives. And almost after every single talk, somebody will come up to me and be like, thank you. Like, that is happening in my life. And I just needed somebody to give me, like, consider me seriously enough to actually say that, like, I wasn't ridiculous for thinking that was happening. So, like, Tillich would give a religious stamp of approval to people who were seemingly not religious at all and just engaging art. And I kind of do the same thing to some video game communities. It's like, you all may not consider yourself religious, but you're, like, fulfilling the sort of lives that often, like, aren't fulfilled in churches, and you're living more deeply than some people who just think that they say the right words and show up on, like, one day a week. They've done all they need to do. So that's why Tillich's exciting to me, because not just because he cared about culture, but he actually did the thing. And I think it's important to do the thing and actually get engaged in a culture that you think is important.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of habits maybe for the, like, more confessionally religious types? Like, if you're grounded in a particular tradition, I think we've developed these habits early and engaging difference or the other, in the, especially the way Christianity and Christendom so connected to colonialism. When difference or the other shows up, the habits, right, have so much to do with, like, generating sameness by the end of the engagement, or getting one to now engage and adopt the narrative that most animates you. And you can see this in mission work and such, but also in some of the more cheesy engagements with different parts of pop culture, where it's like, well, let me find a new way to engage in a sermon illustration using this movie or this video game or whatever. I'm interested in, like, what are the kinds of questions or intuitions that can generate a more fruitful dialogue or a deeper dialogue, one where, right, when you as a philosophical theologian are engaging with people in the industry, they actually hear their deep concerns being given back to them and treated seriously, as opposed to an occasion to eventually get to the invitation to walk that aisle, or, you know, or whatever.
Yeah, something interesting to me is that video games have their own sort of agency that they exert upon players that kind of pushes back against that tendency, maybe, and in its own way says, like, do you really want to do that? Or, like, are you violating somebody here and, like, doing an injustice to them in some way? And the interactive nature of them is really important. So there's games where you kind of have to play them in good faith. So, like, some people just, like, really goof around with video games and they just want to play them the wrong way and they want to see if they can break them. So could they create, like, their own metagame of just how can I mess around with this video game and see if I can break it in some creative way? But there are games where you have to, say, encounter, there's a number of games in the book I talk about that deal with gay or transgender characters. And because you have to interact with them, and they give you a setting where it's like, this is not a political talking point. So it's not just watching a 24-hour news channel, and it's like gay rights being batted back and forth as if people aren't being discussed. It's just this abstract political point. All of a sudden it's, oh, this is Sam in 1995, and this is her bedroom, and these were the things she was looking at and reading when she was thinking, I might be in love with another girl in my class. And they push back and, like, make these moments of, in the case of, say, gay rights, the way that a lot of parents who are against gay rights often switch when their child comes out. Because now it's like, oh, one, I can't hate my child, although that does happen, unfortunately, sometimes. But two, oh, like, a gay person is a person all of a sudden instead of a talking point. Video games kind of have a sort of agency where, even though they're artificial AI characters in the game that you're dealing with, they push back on you like humans being would and actually say, you know, as Levinas would, like, respect me, I'm different, but you have to actually encounter me now. Whereas the way I describe Levinas sometimes is a lot of the isms that we create in society. We encounter people as the skin color, gender, religion, and then if they're the quote unquote wrong one of those, we encounter them that way instead of actually encountering a being there. And video games push back against that tendency in an interesting way. The right sorts of games. There's just like there's serious movies and not in serious movies. There's sports games. There's Call of Duty. I'm not especially theologically interested in those, but there are different sorts of video games that do what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find interesting, right, about what you just said is the way video games it kind of amplify different dials, right? If you're thinking of the different elements of engagement, the way it engages imagination and story and play and these things, because it's so much more participatory, where you, instead of being saturated by the aesthetic of the music and the frame and the cinema and all that kind of thing, or in the liturgical space, it's much more participatory. For like what elements would you pull out about kind of like the unique medium that's video game and the way it generates a kind of cultural engagement that is similar to others but unique for someone trying to tend to the big questions and that take place in it?
So I think the simplest answer is to briefly mention how I modify Tillich. I think I'm basically agreeing with him and just applying him to a different form of culture that he would never have been aware of. He died before the industry started. When he engaged art, he talked about form, content, and import. And these are aspects of art. And he was obsessed with import or spirit or Geist to the exclusion of the others. So he loved the expressionist and impressionist paintings and hated realistic art. So he loved Cézanne, Van Gogh. He especially hated religious depictions of just like, here's a picture, here's a artistic rendition of Mary or Jesus or something. He liked the expressionists because the way he thought of spirit or import was the way they distort reality in their paintings is a kind of reminder that there's more in what's in front of us. So it's kind of a reminder of his ground of being talk, that there's more there than you give it credit for, and something can like burst through and change you. Like you can look at just like you could look at a sunset, or he was really, he loved to meditate in front of the ocean. You can say, well, that's the sun, and I know atmospheric conditions and how this happens, and I know like biologically what's in the ocean, or you can be like moved by like the spirit of it and like how it moves your spirit. You need all of them for video games because each of them can basically do what Tillich wanted his spirit talk to do with paintings. So in the case of just, I had been mentioning games that kind of tell basically queer coming of age stories in the video game format. The content matters. I mean, they're often autobiographical stories, but you get them in a space where you have to interact with the character as opposed to just, say, reading a book about somebody coming out. And there's interactivity in a book. It's not fair to say a book isn't interactive. You do have thoughts about the characters as you read, but when you literally have to make choices about them and interact with them in the space, that character can, say, push back a little bit more against somebody who's maybe reading a book about a gay character and is like, I'm not sure if I like them. In the video game, they can push back a bit more. But that's a kind of straightforward, the content matters. But the form matters in some of the games too. So like form could be thought of as a frantic first-person shooter or really competitive video game has a very different form than a narrative game that might even be more like a digital book in some ways that just wants to tell a story. But this can also be important for different sorts of people who can have themselves really affirmed. I often think of Tillich's book, The Courage to Be, or some of his sermons, which were very popular, like Accept That You're Accepted. Like that, the literal ground of their being is always with them. Society can create senses of estrangement and say that you don't matter, or you're only going to matter if you behave this way or that way. But you can take a sort of personal confidence that God is the ground of being, is literally with you all times. The form of certain games can be really important to that. There's a game called Cart Life that is the guy that created it called it a retail simulator. I call it a poverty or capitalism doesn't care about poor people simulator. And it's really frantic gameplay. If anybody has ever played like Mavis Beacon teaches typing sort of games, or like when you were learning to use a keyboard, any of those typing video games. It's like that turned up to like 11. So you're just frantically mashing out phrases on the keyboard to work at this like minimum wage job. You have like a coffee stand or a newspaper stand, and you're doing frantic tasks all while these meters are going up or down. And one of them is it drains your like psychological health meter. And then you have a daughter to take care of, and you got to spend time with your daughter. There's a custody hearing coming up. So you also have to work because you're trying to show that you're stable enough to gain custody of the daughter. But then if you're not with your daughter, your psychological health also goes down. So end of the story is, you can maybe see where I'm getting. Your psychological meter is basically always going down, and you're trying to live in this situation. And the game does a great job of showing, like, you can't just tell somebody, oh, like, work harder, you can get out of this situation, you know? So the form
Bootstrap
there,
mode activated.
yes, the form there is fantastic. And others actually align with Tillich's sense of spirit. There's a game that's actually being used in pastoral care training. It's called That Dragon Cancer. And this couple who are still Christians, but their son died of pediatric cancer before age 2. And they play with the medium of video games to imagine this literally different world where their son may be dead, but he's still like infinitely matters. And they play with just the fact that video games can create infinite number of fantasy environments to deal with that. So I think those are different ways that different sorts of video games can bring about these life-changing sort of aha moments.
Yeah. Yeah, in the book, Levinas is the other kind of thinker that you spend quite a bit of time with, and given the kind of origin story of Gamergate, I think it makes sense why he would come to mind. For people that may not be too familiar with Levinas and the notion of the other, and what, like, maybe describe what he's doing with the notion of the other, the face, and such, and how that kind of becomes a helpful dialogue partner for the narratives that take place in video games, and what happens even when you tend to those faces that are in the game.
I think my best shorthand for what Levinas is up to is we tend to live up to his points without knowing it often, with friends, family, people who are maybe a little bit like us. And at some point, this is a little bit too different or too uncomfortable. And now I kind of fail to live up to what he means by the other. So Levinas, and this is structurally just interesting to me, that both Tillich and Levinas are doing a lot of work having lived through and then survived World War II, but on different sides of it. And Tillich was like brutally honest with the failures of Germany and connected it to philosophical theology and said, if what we thought was great led up to the Holocaust, well, that tradition is wrong, so let's think about God differently. And Levinas did the same thing for ethics, where he's like, ethics usually comes last after you think about ontology, epistemology, and aesthetics even sometimes. But the Nazis killed almost everybody except for one person in his family in concentration camps. And he was lucky enough to be in a prisoner of war camp because he was a translator in the French army. So he says, well, let's think about ethics differently. And his thinking about ethics differently is that it's not a matter of truth. So it doesn't matter what you know about somebody. And that's what I was kind of referencing a little earlier about, we approach people with a checklist of sorts. Like, okay, I'm about to encounter a black woman who's a Democrat, or, just whatever. And then we encounter that, as opposed to a human being who is different. And no matter everybody's difference, and he meant this really literally because he was watching what was happening in the camps. Levinas says, a genuine encounter of the other is an encounter of their face. And he was actually looking at people's faces in duress and saying the face is just an ethical plea that says, don't kill me, which he meant literally, but more generically, he just means an ethical plea to help me when I'm in need. And we all have that to each other. So we're all actually others to each other. We might think some people are the same religion or the same family, or they're my friends, and thus we're similar, but we're all others to each other. And we tend to actually encounter what somebody needs and listen to them when they're similar. So we kind of like unknowingly live up kind of sort of to what Levinas is talking about. And then there's some like uncomfortable, like, I'm not familiar with this person. They're too different. And then we start slipping up ethically in ways that Levinas wants to fix by encouraging you to actually encounter genuine otherness and not be turned off by it. So it's like it's an inverting of the term and the way it's normally used. Like, othering is bad. We don't want to turn somebody into the other. Levinas's point is, if you understand that we're all others, you shouldn't ethically violate any others.
Mm-hmm. I had kids way earlier than you, so I'm not even up on these games. But one of the ones that you spend time talking about is Papers, Please, as a game set in that Cold War context, wrestling with immigration and such. But maybe talk about that game, but how this framework that you develop in the first half of the book, it gives a way of reading it and taking it seriously as a site of reflection.
Yeah, so quick description of the game for everybody first then. Papers, Please is a game made by Lucas Pope, who's a really interesting single development team. He outsources a few things at the final stage, like translation and stuff, but he's a one-man developer, and he's made some really great games. And this game, it sounds boring on paper, but it gets really interesting really fast. So for me, it would be highlights magazines growing up, like in the doctor's office waiting, and there's two pictures, and it's like 10 things are different. Can you spot the differences? And it's like the lamps are different color and stuff. The gameplay is basically that for processing immigration paperwork. So people come to your booth. It's kind of a retro pixel art game, so it looks like old Nintendo or Super Nintendo graphics a little bit. So these pixelated people come up to your booth, and they hand you documents, and each day you have to follow different rules. So there's a storyline of what's happening in the country, and they get more restrictive, and foreigners aren't allowed, or they are allowed, but now they have to have these 3 additional pieces of paper. And you're just basically looking at numbers, expiration dates, names, etc. And then you have a bar you slide over on the screen, and you stamp accept or reject on their documents and give them back to them. So I'd say it sounds really boring, like processing paperwork, the video game. It's like, no, thank you. That's maybe my job. I don't want to play a video game of this. But the people tell you stories, and some of them are like benign, or they're just like, I'm here for work. I'm here for 3 weeks. See ya. And others are, please don't let in the man behind me. He's selling me into sexual slavery. I'm being trafficked, and I think I'm going to die. Please don't let him in. But he has this correct paperwork in order. But to all these people, you can do whatever you want in terms of accepting and rejecting. So even if they have their paperwork and they have no like ethically charged story, you could reject them if you want. I don't know why you would, but you can do whatever in each of these cases. There's many other scenarios, a husband and wife traveling together, but every individual is processed differently. He has his paperwork in order. She doesn't. They're like retiring together. So like you're going to break up their retirement. What's interesting and what relates to Levinas a bit is that all others matter. It's not just, and this is like the aha moment I try and get my students to see when I teach philosophy and pop culture. We play some of these games in class, including Papers, Please. It's not just a game about immigrant rights. It's a game about ethically how we behave. And it's a great like a literal sandbox or an ethical playground to try out Levinas's ideas before you maybe violate them and harm somebody that you didn't mean to in real life. Because it shows great sympathy for Border Patrol officers too. Because if you process people incorrectly, you get your pay docked. So you can help out this woman who says she's being trafficked, but then you get your pay docked because you don't process the guy correctly. And then at each day you get this screen that breaks down how much you got paid. And then you have a wife, a child, and an uncle and another relative living with you. And it says if they're hungry or if they're sick and how they're doing. And then with your money, you have to pay rent, you have to buy food, you have to pay for heat. And if they're sick, you have to buy medicine. So it's like the Border Patrol officer matters too. Like they have families and they have a job to do. And if they don't do them well enough, they could get fired or they could get in trouble. So in terms of Tillich and Levinas, I see two things going on here. I can see people struggling with the immigration system and really trying to flee almost certain death, famine, oppressive governments. There's a great storyline that you don't fully figure out later in the game where you seem like you're processing people correctly, and then it dings you, like a ticket comes up from the bottom of the screen saying you've got a citation. I'm like, what am I doing wrong? And it said invalid or incorrect gender. The gender didn't match. And later on in the game, people are trying to smuggle in contraband, like under their clothes. So they give you a body scanner. And then you can see the pixelated, like, naked bodies. It's kind of like the things in the airports now. And then it's like, oh, the government that I'm working for doesn't acknowledge transgender people. So, like, all these different reasons people could be fleeing. It's not just about immigrants, but you can imagine immigrants playing the game and getting a real Tillichian courage to be, like, they matter. The game, when I said games have agency, the game is pushing back on players to arguably encourage them to play it, quote unquote, incorrectly. Like, don't process the paperwork correctly. Like, play the game wrong because this person matters. That's Tillich's, like, ground of being manifesting for somebody via a piece of culture, how that happens. And then for Levinas, because it has sympathy for the Border Patrol officer and the people with stories, it's a reminder that it's not just like, oh, okay, I should, like, have sympathy for immigrants. No, it's more than that. It does convey an ethical message about we're all in need, and that can create complex situations. So what do? Like, your family matters, but this woman who's being trafficked also matters. Maybe if you have enough reserved money because you, like, processed everybody really quickly the day before and there were no ethically charged issues, you're like, I think I have enough money in reserve that I can help them. But if you don't, and 3 of your family members are, like, really sick, what do? So it is one of my favorite examples. So I'm glad you asked about that one.
Yeah. No, I was sitting there, as I went through it, thinking of, I wonder if I can call going to play these games research. Hence, assigning the book. And but
okay. I will say I annoy my wife because, as I said, I grew up with the video game industry, so I still like to play video games for fun. It was a hobby of mine, and I connected it to my work. It still is a hobby of mine, even though I now work on it. So I will annoy her when I say, 5 minutes, I'm doing research.
So one of the other games that came up in it is Depression Quest. Well, just go ahead and tell us about the game, because it was one of those places where the game itself is something to think about, but also you spend some time thinking, helping us process what we know about both the science that's taking place in the game and the science of game playing and that kind of thing.
So Depression Quest is also good to talk about because it's one of the games that started Gamergate. So the creator, Zoe Quinn, was harassed for creating Depression Quest. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details because it was all just made-up lies about... She got some coverage of the game because it's interesting. It was basically semi-autobiographical. It's a little bit like a digital choose-your-own-adventure book where you get to a certain page and then make a choice and then flip to another page. Except in this choose-your-own-adventure book, because your character has depression, some of the options are crossed off. So it does a really good job of conveying you can't just tell somebody with depression, hey, be happy, hey, snap out of it, just, like, be happier, your friends are here, why can't you be happy?
Well, they could just make their bed and know.
Yeah, because, the options crossed off. And the options that are crossed off change. So you're reading text, and it is there's kind of like mood audio playing, depending on how your situation's going, and it can get better and it can get worse. And there's points where you can take medication for depression, and depending on what sorts of choices you make out of the ones available, if you're getting a little bit better, more options are actually available and fewer are crossed off, and vice versa. You might only have one thing that you can choose and the rest are crossed off, and you're looking at them going, well, this is going to make things worse, but I can't do anything else. And it does a good job of conveying depression limits options. And there's, biochemistry to that. And it pushes back against, like I said, like knee-jerk reactions of just, oh, be happier. It's a party and your friends are here. So why can't you should be happy now. Depression is fixed, right? That's not, not how it works. I also use it sometimes talking about free will and determinism in ways that just we're completely free to do whatever we want is kind of an overstated notion of free will, because there's, again, a biochemical determinism going on in this game. So that's the setup of the game.
Yeah, and when I think it's easy to see how, like, the moment you start to think with the game, the kind of situations it can put you in for those that have struggled with depression, like having your experience told honestly, gives you there's a sense of solidarity, right? When your story's been told well. Yeah, much like, for me, it was all in depression. I always know which songwriters when I'm depressed I listen to. And people that know me well will then check in when Tripp is listening to certain things on a consistent basis. And I can imagine it functioning that way. And also the kind of learning you get of being reminded of just how our life situations and our biochemical makeup and all these things in the crossed off options, especially when we're looking at big issues or challenges someone's faced, how it's sometimes our judgment of other people imagines there is no option that's crossed off, right? And like part of what protects the ability from different spaces of privilege to judge others and to moralize their situation is that kind of, that myth of a perfect freedom where everyone walks around with a cornucopia of options available to them. I thought that the description in the game of the game kind of like raised that question in a way that the player, right, is now being invited into that experience in a different way.
Yeah, and you didn't exactly ask this, but can I just add on a little bit about, there is a kind of neuroscience component of what I see going on in video games that I think is relevant to just bring up right now. Since I mentioned it's basically conveying how biochemistry interacts with depression. This also goes back to our time in Claremont. So when I was doing my doctoral work there, I worked in Paul Zach's Center for Neuroeconomic Studies. So I worked in his neuroscience lab, and the lab is known for studying oxytocin, which was first found in breastfeeding mothers, or it was first kind of made a big deal when breastfeeding mothers and babies got big spikes in it. So it was thought like, oh, this might be the biological basis for like nurturing. It's not just in humans, but other animals get spikes in it. But it's a whole lot more than that. So we now know that it's involved in kind of like small, everyday, maybe not earth-shattering, but small, everyday cycles of virtuous behavior. So it's the phenomena of like if somebody's in a drive-through and they pay for the person behind them, and then they pay for the person behind them, and then they pay for the person behind them, this cycle keeps going. Oxytocin is released when people do small little kind things for one another, or have a moment of empathy or real connection with somebody else. So I told my students after we went back to in-person classes after COVID, when you hugged your friends or shook their hands or even had to open a door and hold it open for somebody for the first time in a while, you all got little spikes in oxytocin. And because of that, your friend was more likely to kind of pass that on and do something nice and caring for somebody else. There was aha moment for me when the lab put together an experiment just watching St. Jude's cancer research videos, and they spliced one up and saw how different sorts of scenes impacted oxytocin release. And the emotional child has cancer, everybody's crying scene got big spikes in oxytocin. Whereas even though people were told this is a cancer like fundraising commercial, other parts where they're just like walking around the zoo at one point or just going about daily life didn't get any oxytocin release. I was like, there doesn't actually have to be an in-person interaction for oxytocin to be released. And I connected this both to video games and to Levinas's point about the other, because he says the other is non-phenomenal, which is the stuff I was saying about you don't actually encounter them as a phenomenon of this is their skin color, this is their height, this is the color of their hair. All of their physical phenomena don't matter. It's just the ethical plea, first and foremost, that he doesn't want you to violate. So it's like there's that, where you actually don't need to physically encounter another. You just need to be ethically moved by them and like understand that they matter. And then oxytocin with video games, you could encounter Levinas's notion of the other in video games if you can get that same sort of spike where you're actually moved by another chemically in your body. So I connect that to Levinas. I also connect it to, I think it happens in all the games because you're encountering characters that push back on you, like I've been emphasizing. But certainly, Depression Quest could have that sort of impact on somebody as well.
Yeah, no, that was the other element I was hoping to get to. See, you just read my mind.
That's what we get for going back and forth for 15 years or whatever now.
Yeah, man, it just made me feel old.
That's all right. My students make me feel old all the time. So
yeah. Well, hey. We'll feel a lot older when Phil retires. That'd be the time when we're like, oh wow, we really are old. So, kind of like broadening it out a bit. There's lots of conversations currently about just how human beings and community and engagement are being shaped by the kind of mediation, but when our relationships are being mediated by screens and this kind of thing, like when you, as a theologian of culture and such, and you hear, you could think of the cheesy kind of dumb, really worries people get about video games, like, wow, well, they're playing with guns, and that's why we have so much gun violence, right? And that's kind of sitting there, and you get similar ones about video games. I was talking with a friend of mine that was, cognitive scientist on a research project with video games, where you find out that like the collaborative first-person shooter games are actually good for adolescent boys to play. It lowers all sorts of things when it goes to negative outcomes, increases quality of life and their ability to cooperate and communicate in intense situations, contrary to certain assumptions. And then there's a growing awareness around research of the problematic ways both the images of others and the image of yourself and curating that plays out. When you think of the kind of growing function of the screen as a place that both our self-image and the collective image takes place, are there certain kind of questions or intuitions or fears that are worth tending to, and others that you go, maybe we don't spend all of our time reflecting there?
Well, I will say there, like, genuine concerns about representation and depictions they're still a problem in the industry, but they're getting way better. There's not as many harmful tropes. Like, women in video games used to literally just be objects to prop up the male hero. So what are they? Literally the thing to be saved by the male hero of the video game. So that's the save the princess trope that goes, back to Super Mario Brothers. Now you have female leads in games, like huge franchises like the Mass Effect series of video games. You can play as a female Shepard or a male Shepard, and Commander Shepard is the main character. And FemShep, female Shepard, is like the fans' canonical, like, no, FemShep is the real Shep. So, like, the industry is, again, I'm impressed with how quickly the industry is moving to, like, fix those things. So that's a real concern, but it's also getting better quicker. And the best example I can give of that, so beyond the anecdotes I just gave, is that most people will probably have heard in controversial ways of the Grand Theft Auto series of video games, and even they can't get away with it anymore. So for the longest time, they got to get away with, they call themselves satires of America, but even the satires are problematic, and they're just like really reproducing problematic aspects. They don't really understand what satire is. But now, so like there's all sorts of misogynistic and homophobic and jokes, quote unquote, in the game. But it was leaked that the lead character in Grand Theft Auto 6, and it's not an option, you have to play as her, is a woman. And if Rockstar, who makes those games, can no longer just repeat the male hero stereotype, and a woman is going to be in the game, then that says something about the way video game culture, like the human beings playing the games and talking about them, are like driving some of these changes. That says a lot to me. Now, in terms of being suspicious about screen use, I actually see a lot of ways in which video games are more real in a really helpful way and healthy way than the real world for a lot of people. And I'll just assume your audience, we're all just a bunch of wonderful religious pluralists here. So there's a game that was released during the pandemic called Animal Crossing on the Nintendo Switch. Really really relaxing video game. You just have an island and you play house on it. You grow crops, you decorate your house, you virtual little life there. And every player has their own island, and you can visit other players' islands. And during Easter, during the pandemic, the heart of the stay-at-home orders coincided with Easter. Nintendo put Christian objects in the game, so you could kind of make an altar on your island. And some churches actually held Easter services on an Animal Crossing island, so that the congregation could, their little avatars could be together as opposed to gathering in Zoom boxes. So there was actually a shared virtual space as opposed to being separated in Zoom boxes. But as it always happens, the Westerners get something for them and the rest of the world is ignored. So Ramadan's going on at the same time and nothing was done for the breaking of the fast. But this developer, Rami Ismail, who I've gotten to know through the process of writing this book, he had the know-how, and he's a practicing Muslim. So he made items in the game and he said it's what he remembered his childhood breaking of the fast being like. So that's kind of how he decorated it. And he sent out a tweet. He has a pretty good following back before Twitter was totally destroyed. He had a pretty good following, so he sent out a tweet, and people responded in the thousands, and he even invited non-Muslims, and they basically had a kind of comparative theology festival where everybody was respectful. People who didn't know anything about Islam got to learn about it, and some of the people who participated and were Muslim were asked about why. And I just want you to picture, say, a Muslim student at a college that has basically no support for non-Christian students, or living in a part of the world where there's maybe a handful of other Muslims and certainly no mosque within reasonable distance. That breaking of the fast in Animal Crossing was better than their real, that was more real than their real life, and a better experience of what that means to them, because they actually got to be in community as opposed to being isolated. So I actually see a lot of promise, and you talked about mediation, of our experiences being mediated through video games. I can give other examples of how players who never met each other but always played together in groups, one of them dies of cancer all of a sudden, or is diagnosed and going to die, and they either get together and have a memorial service for them in person, or if they can, some have gotten together and been at the deathbed of their player friend that they never met. But the relationships were so real that they made sure they could say goodbye in person before they died. And there's tons of stories like that, in-game memorials for people who have died that have been created, and legit funeral services where thousands of people show up. That's not false or not real because it's in a video game. I consider it very real.
Yeah. No, I think those are powerful examples, and I wonder if part of the reason, at least the dominant part of culture's worry and wrestling with it, is, one, I think boomers control way too much of what we decide to argue and fight about, and their experience of most digitally mediated things are places where they're passively being sold things through algorithms that monetize and organize their fears, right? If you think of what happens in places where what you're engaging on the screen is basically to hold your attention so other people can sell you things, that's really different than whatever happens when you play Cart Life or Papers, Please, right? Or Depression Quest or Animal Crossing and these kinds of things. If what we're focusing on is in some senses, the technology of delivery versus the narrative means of engagement, then I think we end up collapsing things that have this beautiful power, say, of having community when you break the fast of Ramadan, or learning about your neighbor's religion, or these kind of things, or learning about the experience of someone with depression, or and that kind of stuff, versus, being reminded that you're, inadequate in a million ways, but there is an app for that.
So I told you earlier that one of the main places I challenge Tillich, which is a mild challenge, is his theory of art. So I take all of his components seriously. In a way, I do agree with Tillich in that there's parts of the video game industry that I'm not especially theologically enthusiastic about, just the way he wasn't enthusiastic about some pieces of art. So just like, Facebook algorithms are driven to create conflict because they want you to engage. And if you get angry, you engage more. And if you have a pleasant experience, you're just like, okay, that was nice. And you go on with your day. There are some video games, and this has lessened because they got challenged in all sorts of courts across the world. Loot boxes were a big thing. So it was like a gambling mechanic in video games. So you could spend real world money to get items that would help you in the game, but what you get out of the box was randomized. So you would keep buying more boxes until you got the really cool stuff. So there is a pernicious aspect to some games. But
I have purchased loot boxes. I just didn't get to, for games I was not playing.
Oh, yeah.
I've bought them for my son.
For Fortnite?
Fortnite. I was also said yes a lot more when it was the Star Wars game, mostly because not that I was any good at playing the new Battlefront. I could dominate on the PlayStation 2 Battlefront game. Now it's just way too complicated. I don't have my ability to battle in the Star Wars universe using a PlayStation controller. Once I got to PlayStation 4 and 5, I did not age like LeBron. I just am getting shot and spinning around too much. So I bought these little points so you could get new skins and little weapons and things.
Yep. So
I wanted to be. I really liked when you could play an Ewok, and you could sneak up and just take out a little stormtrooper.
Yeah, there was lots. I mean, there's funny skins in that game. There's some good videos of just people went a little overboard with hordes of Darth Vaders in that game. But they're funny. But so the games I talk about are like indie games. And that terminology is somewhat going away. But the small teams, and they're not.
But you also use non-traditional games a lot.
Yeah, so that's my shorthand. So in the video game industry, they tend to call them indie games. That's kind of transforming into AA games, or like, is there indie AAA? Like these used to be distinctions about budgets. So Call of Duty and Madden that you see commercials of on TV and on the internet are like AAA games because they have a huge budget. So these are like the big blockbuster movies. And then indie were smaller teams of maybe like 1 to 10 people. 15, but like small teams, whereas those games are made by hundreds to thousands of people. Because the language is changing, I just kind of call them non-traditional. But they're explicitly, and some of them actually become big successes, but that's not why they make the games. The way that Call of Duty must make X number of dollars, or they will say you've got to make it differently in the future. And that's actually something they're dealing with now. Same with Madden. And you've got to like leverage these loot boxes and whatever because we've got to meet this quota, pretty much. The indie teams often want to tell their own stories or just an interesting story. And those are the games that they're just making them because the medium allows these interactive experiences that are unlike other mediums. And those are the ones that I tend to find really interesting. But there's exceptions. I mean, I positively referenced Mass Effect. That was a massively huge AAA franchise of video games. So there are outliers, but I overwhelmingly tend to look at indie movements, just like I know a lot of like conversations on this podcast or like a lot of healthy things are in grassroots religious movements that are very exciting and worthwhile, even if, pick your denomination, statistics say they're dying off. It's not unlike what's exciting in the religious scene in a lot of ways. It's smaller, It's smaller groups that are up to different things.
Well, okay, you mentioned briefly in the book some of the controversy around The Last of Us, I think in the second version of The Last of Us. Now, I've bought all these games and I've watched videos of them being played when Elgin does well and such. But I didn't know anything about them really until the TV show came out. And you know, when your kid is coming to you, well, kid, okay, your 15-year-old is looking at you like, no, I want to stay up to watch this TV show on HBO that's based on a video game. In my head, I'm thinking, right, that cheesy Mortal Kombat movie, or you know, the kind of videos or movies or TV shows based on video games that we played when we were growing up, and then was rather moved by the first season of The Last of Us TV show, and just in getting to talk to it with Elgin, who, you know, has also played the games, there was a whole nother layer of the experience of the show for him, because he had gone through so much of the story and stuff playing the game and having these different attachments to the characters. He also knows more that, you know, happens in the future and such. Like when that show became a phenomenon, and all of a sudden there were, I bet, millions of people like me that were like, really? A TV show about a video game? Tell me about your experience of that, because that would be like them doing a biopic of Whitehead, right? And they're like, why are we doing this? And I'm just like, oh, you like that show? You know, like he taught Oppenheimer. You know, like I'm trying, you know, like you're sitting there like, what's going on? But when you're thinking of people that maybe that are new to thinking about video games this way, and then these stories that were crafted and developed for a video game all of a sudden become appointment viewing for millions of people. To me, that was one of these moments where I go, oh, maybe more is going on in a medium I stopped playing, you know, a long time ago. And maybe Ben Chicka's right about that, even though he's wrong about some other things.
Yeah, well, regardless of my thoughts on process theology, we can agree I'm right about video games, for today at least. I think lots of people, it became such a phenomenon also because Pedro Pascal's such a big thing right now. So the fact that he was in it and it was good, it's like, okay, he lended his credence to it and it's also a good show. People then had to like, okay, what on earth? It's about a video game? Or it's like, it's almost literally retelling the video game story. So it's not even loosely based on, like, it is pretty closely telling the video game story. I think that could have been an aha moment for some people. And it's not like all of what I've been saying is unique to video games. It's just different in video games. Like, Tillich was writing about art, as we've said several times. Could his points manifest, which is the fun thing about his theory of culture. Like, it's not just theologians talking about it and then it has to happen in our churches. He's talking about culture can affirm somebody's being and like give them the courage that like they are who they are and they just need to accept that, even if society is pushing and pulling them in 25 different directions and not letting them be themselves. Sure, it can happen in TV shows and movies. And one of the things that I like most about the TV show is that it kind of saw. So Gamergate's like a foil in the book. So bad video game industry, and then let's see how the video game industry gets better. It saw a similar problem in the video game and wanted to change it. And in what is widely regarded as one of the favorite episodes, where, oh, now I'm blanking on his name, the actor who plays Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec.
That guy.
You know,
yeah. With a cool beard. Post videos of himself drinking bourbon by fire.
Yes. There's a widely regarded as everybody's favorite episode based on everything I've read. A wonderful episode, even if it's not your favorite. In the game, these two gay men had a falling out, and one of them hanged themselves, and the other one killed themselves in response to the other one hanging themselves. And it was nasty. They had a fight, and then they both just ended themselves. In the show, they do end up dying, but for very different reasons, and they actually get to have a happy, long life together. And the way that they cared for each other, and then one of them basically just gets sick and dies, and there's just no treatments because it's the zombie apocalypse and there aren't hospitals to treat people. They get to live long lives and just die of old age, except it's the zombie apocalypse and the other doesn't want to be without the other, so they kind of... spoiler alert for how it all ends. Spoiler, 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 spoiler. Okay, here it is. They take poison together and die in bed, but that was a happy ending for them because they got to live a long life together. And that little twist of emphasize, like in the game, you had to stumble upon like notes to find what happened. It wasn't a main story. And in the show, they made it an entire episode about nothing but their relationship. And it was moving. And that's, I sometimes say Tillich's The Courage to Be is just about being seen by a piece of culture. Like that, I think gay people would be seen by that episode in a way that they weren't seen by the way the video game treated them. So that right there is an example of Tillich's theology of culture.
One of the things about even that particular episode is, it took a whole episode and dwelt on their relationships. And there are all these little particular things like, cooking for each other or getting dressed, and the kind of things that it got so specific and the love was so tender. Sometimes attending closely allows the narrative to seize a larger number of people, right? Like by going so specific, the resonance of it connects to all those places in other people's lives. And I think it did very similar to what a number of the games thinking about, what is it like to live with depression, or what is it like to having to make these very specific choices and such like that. One of the gifts of storytelling in a variety of mediums is that it can tell something really specific and then see something much more universal. And I think that dynamic is one of the reasons Tillich's framing, I think, is helpful for religious people because, in many ways we're seized by particular stories, but also it's not that specific story that is the universal. It's something that's getting itself done in these stories.
Well, I think you can even think about it beyond Tillich. So just think about what goes on in theology and then what happens in religious communities. And you and I love metaphysics and ontology and cosmology, and we could talk about that all day. But then there is ultimately a question about payoff and like, what does this mean for actual human beings living their lives? How am I supposed to treat other human beings? What does this mean for us being in community practicing together? And then we don't just want to practice together. We care about engaging the community outside of us, hopefully helping them, embracing them. But even then, that can often be thought of in terms of like still abstractly, like categories, like we want to help this sort of person or these people. And video games are helpful sorts of video games. So my phrase non-traditional video games can be a helpful reminder of that you're always talking about people here. And there's windows into other people's sorts of lives that if you care about this issue, it's not just an issue. There are people impacted by it because it's not just interacting with the characters in the game. So there's like a virtual interacting with otherness because you're interacting with non-player characters, NPCs in the game. But there's also really well-rendered environments. You get to look through diaries. You get to see what they were reading, in Gone Home, they do a great job, since you mentioned it earlier. There's only a few people who you hear speak in the game. So when you find certain diaries or objects, audio logs play, so you can hear the characters talking about what's going on. But there's a mom, a dad, an aunt, a friend. So there's lots of other characters. And all of them had different actors that hand wrote all the notes, diaries, everything else in the game. And all those were scanned into the game, and they look like real objects. And they are actually written by people that played those characters. So all the writing is their actual handwriting. So you get a sense of place. Like people are in an existential location where they do certain things. And that's how it's not just interacting with a digital 3D model of a human being. It's interacting with people that have an actual context, and you see what they were worried about and what they were reading and what they were watching. There's a fake knockoff Super Nintendo in the game, so what they were playing. They're basically the two girls that are falling in love playing Street Fighter together, or Street Fighter 2 specifically. Those are human beings. They're not just immigrants. If they're not, different immigrants have different contexts and situations, and video games kind of remind you of that. Even, well-intentioned embraces of others get very abstract and not about human beings too quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's one other question, something that came up recently reading The Courage to Be. Tillich talks about the function of anxiety and how it gets expressed in these different ways, and that different parts of history have these different centers, right? And so like ontic anxiety dominated the ancient and moral ones in medieval, and in the modern period, this challenge of meaninglessness, the spiritual anxiety is prevalent in kind of the center. Do you think that still holds? And if you're thinking about, like tending to how video, like what is happening culturally and how it's revealed in these texts, what are the unique facets of how kind of this larger existential anxiety is being expressed culturally?
So I think meaninglessness is probably still around. I don't think it's like in a previous epoch yet. But I look at the sorts of stories that are told in games, or even to go back to Cart Life, since it was explained a little earlier. There's like a real age of neoliberal collapse that is making a lot of attempts to live a certain way. So if you want to be an artist, or if you just want to express value in certain ways, it's like, nope, that's not possible. Or you have to work 12 different gigs to be able to make that something you can still do in your spare time. And in video games, I can see them both seeing people that are kind of pushed and pulled in all sorts of different directions like that. But they themselves are like beautiful art. They are works of art. They are pieces of art in different ways than other art forms. But I consider video games art. Ebert was wrong. Ebert famously said video games are not and can never be art. He's not around to argue with me anymore, but he's wrong. I see video games hearing and seeing that, not solving it. When I read Courage to Be, I don't see assertions, because Tillich was always also concerned with ambiguity. So whenever you say yes, you also have to say no, because for him, our essence breaks through in the world of existence. We're not looking to a heavenly realm. We're looking at the way the ground of our being breaks through right here now and kind of grasps us and affirms us. But the forces of existence are still there. The neoliberal decline is still real. But I see games kind of expressing that these things still matter. And they are like affirmations of value in some way to people that are basically being tunneled down this very narrow path in life, because that's the only thing capitalism will value. And video games, at least in their digital medium, say you're more than that, and we hear you, even if capitalistic forces don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and that's something. I mean, you even talk about, you briefly talk about the socialist decision in the book, and the way the growing economic crisis in his time escalated the importance of certain questions. This has been a blast, Ben, and I really enjoyed the book. Looking forward to getting to talk to you again. Is there any place we should direct people on the interwebs to find you?
Well, thank you for having me, Tripp. I also had a blast. I will say, in the process of writing this book, we kind of touched upon it. I deleted all my social media accounts, so I can't just say follow me if you want to have cool conversations, but I'm easy to find if you want to send me an email. It's not hidden. So if you just Google Benjamin Chicca, you'll find my faculty profile. I read emails and get in touch if you are curious about this stuff. And other than that, the book's available everywhere on the internet. So easy enough to find if you're interested in it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.